Welcome back to another Chatting with Wisdom. And for those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Rollie Allaire. Gigadomi Gunkwe is my spirit name, and I'm your host of Chatting with Wisdom. So, Chatting with Wisdom is a weekly interview series featuring amazing women. There are different ways that women are amazing, and we get to celebrate that. So, I invite you to join me in my private Facebook group, Mind, Body, Heart, and Soul Connection. And you can also find a similar group on Telegram that I've been using this year to share positivity. And so, today I would like to welcome Tania. So Tania, and of course, my screen refreshed, so I lost her bio. So Tania Lopez is a parenting coach who is qualified and experienced teacher, counselor, and hypnotherapist. She works with moms who are at their wits' ends because their children challenge them at every turn by refusing to listen to them and have regular meltdowns. Tania loves helping moms to stop feeling disheartened with themselves and their parenting and to bring some joy and fun into their own um, and their children's lives. In addition, she has a new offering to support corporates to keep their talent through well-being programs, which help eliminate stress, overwhelm, and guilt for the overstretched parents, so that they have improved focus and presence, whether they are at home or at work. This, in turn, helps improve staff morale, productivity, and reduces costs of recruiting new staff in order to replace lost talent. Tania loves working with the unconscious processes as they dictate so many of our beliefs, our feelings, and our actions. Conscious thoughts and actions can't fight off the unconscious drivers until they have been disarmed. She loves to help clients release those unconscious patterns so that they can navigate through life in a more connected way. So, welcome. So,
Thank
today
you.
we're talking about how to eliminate feelings of guilt, shame, and failure of parenting. And like we can even take away though when parenting is because I think that applies to so many of us and really impacts what it is that we're doing and how we are navigating through our life. So, can you tell me a little bit about how did you get um, into this line of work? How did you get into being where you are right now?
So, my background, as you said, is that I've been working with families now for 20 years, and I've been teaching parenting programs for about 14 years. And about a decade ago, I trained as a counselor. And then a few years ago, I trained as a hypnotherapist. And I've just been putting all of that together.
Beautiful.
And then I've been putting that together for my business. So, the offerings that I make for, I suppose the majority of my clients are mums, although I've worked with dads as well. So that's how I've kind of combined everything. And I think the hypnotherapy led me down a different path, because with hypnotherapy, it was really looking at some of our unconscious patterns, behaviors, habits. Because I noticed so many mums were saying, I'm behaving in ways that I'm not really happy with, and I'm repeating some of the things that I said I would never do with my own children. And that itself brought so much, kind of feelings of shame and feelings of
Yeah.
failure whenever people talk about how they're parenting. And I really noticed this with mums. The every program I've taught, although they would come for behavior, because that's, I really want help with changing my child's behavior, so many conversations were around this feeling of guilt, shame, and failing. So I do a lot of talks on this because I'm so passionate about it. And I think
Beautiful.
these feelings have such a negative impact on how we live our lives, how we show up for ourselves, how we show up for children. So yeah.
And I think that makes a huge difference as well. Sorry, I'm making noise with my mic. Um, and so and it really makes a huge impact as to how we look at things and more particularly ourselves. And one of the things that I really like that you said, because this has actually come up in conversation in this last week, and I love synchronicity, I love how synchronicity falls into play, is that there's that conversation of um, I'm doing things that I didn't like from my mom, right? So like I'm resembling my mom right now in this moment. And there are areas that I wanted to be able to change. I wanted to be able to have that different focus in my life and be able to have that. and have that impact. And so I really like how that synchronicity of the conversations that I've been having with clients this week has kind of lined in with that whole reflecting back of, okay, some of the patterns are the same, and so how do they come to be? And that aspect of unconsciousness, right? So that unconsciousness piece is where that comes into play.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
can you tell me a little bit more about that unconsciousness piece?
Okay, so whenever I talk about parenting, I talk about unconscious, conscious, and self-conscious parenting. Um, and self-conscious parenting, which I would say is in the category of unconscious parenting, has come up so much in my work with mums. So unconscious parenting is where we're not fully aware of the drivers that impact our behavior, our thoughts, the way we relate to people, the way we relate to children. And self-conscious parenting, it's where we're hyper aware of other people's perceptions of us. So we feel constantly judged by other people, and we feel other people are evaluating our parenting practices. And so what can happen with self-conscious parenting is that we try and change what we would normally do with children because we want people to think well of us. Now, conscious parenting is where we can start to make changes. So conscious parenting is where you're aware that your past programming, your past habits, there are a lot of influences from your past that are now impacting the way that you show up and the way that you interact with children. And I would say the key thing is that when you go down the road of conscious parenting, you become much more empowered because you're not blaming your children. You're not saying it's their behavior I want to change. You realize that children are just being children, but somehow their behavior doesn't, it makes us want to change them. We want them to do things a certain way rather than, allowing children to explore, allowing children to be, and really wanting to manage their behaviors and manage what they do. And that's how we can sometimes feel in control. If we can control another human being, I feel more in control. And unfortunately, it doesn't work like that.
And that word control is something that we do unconsciously, right? So it's not that
Absolutely.
we set out to, okay, I've just had children and now I'm going to control every aspect of their life, right? So
Yeah,
it becomes
absolutely.
that part of us that is in that unconscious being. Like we don't set out to having all the concerns. And so my children are now grown, and I know that at times that I've actually had, like, okay, is my mother behind me? Like words literally just came out of my mouth that and were spewed, that it was like, I vowed I would never ever say those words, but yet it just spewed out of my mouth very naturally. And it's like, okay, that's not my objective, right?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people say that, I don't have a manual for parenting, but actually, we've all had the download of parenting from our own caregivers. So that's why the programming that we've had, all these things come out that we weren't planning on using. And somehow, because we've had this download, which is full of viruses and needs rebooting and upgrading, um, controls us a little bit because the things that you don't want to do just start happening. Before you know it, you're behaving and saying things that you thought you would never say. And with that, I have to say, comes a lot of shame and feelings of failure. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And especially when we've set it out that that's not how we're going to respond, or that's not how we're going to deal with things.
Yeah.
And so it makes a huge difference of and kids are more resilient than we believe, right? So like I think that that's also something for us to be able to remember, is to be able to help to alleviate a little bit of that shame and guilt, is being able to, like, being conscious of it, being aware of some of the changes, being very conscious about some of the things that are going on. And so that is and so like that takes me back to my son when he was my youngest son, when he was probably, I think he was probably about 7 or 8. He might have been a little bit younger. And so one of the things that I did teach them is that, so like, if I've reiterated some of those past patterns in programming, that we would have conversations of, okay, like, that's not okay, or having that conversation. But one of the things that I taught them was being able to voice themselves and having the ability to be able to share their own thoughts and feelings about whatever the situation is. It might not change the situation, it might not change the way that things are, but because I wanted them to have different programming, I wanted them to, like, if I did something that I was like, yeah, I vowed I was never going to do that, but yet I've done it. We've had those conversations around it, and so that they were able to process. And so what I thought was really interesting is my youngest, he was running around in the grass with his white socks on, and my mom happened to be over, and my mom did her normal, okay, you have to, where's your shoes, you can't be outside without your shoes, and like, it's the middle of summer, who cares, and he should probably take his socks off, but it's not the end of the world if he's got his socks on. I will either scrub them or I will just go buy some new ones. It's not the end of the world. It's not a battle that I'm prepared to take. And so whereas my mom, that would have been a battle that she was taking. And so my son looked at her, and because she was going off on him, and he looked at her and he said, Mare, my mom doesn't care, and she does my laundry, so I think I'm good. And then went off to continue to run. And my mom was like, just like, oh my God, I can't believe that he spoke to me like that. I was like, okay, was he rude? And she's like, well, no, but like, he was like, I told him to put his shoes on. And I'm like, he's right. I really don't care. Right. It's not a battle that I'm choosing.
Yeah.
And so, and so for the most part, I was able to be conscious of most of the things that I was doing, and being able to do that, and taking that. But then there were other times when it was like, I was at my wit's ends, and I didn't know what else to do. Or if you don't eat all your dinner, you're not going to have dessert for the rest of the year, right?
I really love what you're saying, Rollie. You know, before you were just talking about how if things didn't go well, you did some repair work with your children. And I think that's really important, that it's not about being perfect, because no relationship is ever going to be perfect, and especially the parenting one, because as your children are growing, you're growing with them. It's a new role. It's there'll be new situations all the time, but repair is really, really important. And you're right, there are going to be times when we move out of consciousness and we become more unconscious. And so when I talk about the three, the conscious, unconscious, and self-conscious parenting, I don't talk about them as if they're three separate beings. We can move in and out of all three of them in the space of, in a very short space of time. So yeah, it's not about being this one kind of, one thing that we should hold up. It's that it's all of them. But really the key thing to, I would say, becoming more conscious and to deal with these feelings of guilt, shame, and failure, it's compassion. It's whether we can meet ourselves with compassion. Shall I talk a little bit about failure, guilt, and shame?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So then I'll talk a little bit more about compassion, because I think that is the key to conscious parenting. And I always say that when you start off with compassion, it's to start off with yourself first, because we're very good at extending things to other people, but we don't necessarily do that for ourselves. So I can talk about failure first, if you like, because that's something that comes up a lot when I'm working with clients. And so the first thing I would say is, where do these feelings of failure come from? And they usually come from our past, from our childhood. Probably when we didn't, we made a mistake, or we didn't do something right, and we were made to feel not good enough or not enough. And that feeling really stays with us. And then and then obviously we're going to keep having experiences, and that feeling keeps getting reignited. So one of the ways that I talk about when it comes to dealing with failure is to ask questions. Now, when you look at toddlers and they're learning to walk, they will fall down 100 times. And no toddler ever says, that's it, I'm giving up now. I've fallen over too many times. They keep going. They don't see every time they fall down as a failure. That's it, I can't walk. You just don't get that. Toddlers will keep getting up and keep going. And so somewhere along the line, from when we were learning to walk and when we were learning to talk, some things happened where we became afraid of falling. We became afraid of failing. And at what point did that happen? And so I always get people to ask some questions like, is it okay for me to fail? And if the answer is no, why is it not okay to fail? And compare yourself to a toddler. Why is it okay for a toddler to keep falling? And, just keep going and not feeling shame, not feeling like they have failed. And I think this is the thing that when, as children, older children and adults, when we fail, sometimes we see that as the full stop. I've failed, and there's almost a line drawn. Whereas failure is actually the launch pad of, new insights, new learning, new awakening, new growth, and possibilities. And so I always remind people that whenever you're failing, it means that you've moved out of your comfort zone and you're moving into new territory. So when we don't feel as competent or as capable, we feel like we're failing, and we don't understand that we're actually in that process of learning and integrating new experiences. And sitting with that discomfort of new learning can be very tricky.
And I love what it is that you said about it being that failure is the launch pad, right? So I love that. I love that analogy because it really is. That is where we're going to. So like, so if at once you don't succeed, try and try again, right? So
Yeah.
that whole piece. But we oftentimes don't continue to try. We oftentimes just stop right where we are. We're not making it. It's not getting far enough. We're not getting to where it is that we need to be, and then we just stop. And then one of the other things that I think, in terms of that impacts that in terms of our parenting is that we and like you said, we get the downloads from our parents. Well, then we're downloading onto our own children, right? So so that's also really important, as well
Yeah.
as to be able to have that having that conversation. So knowing like we're not going to do everything perfectly, things are not going to flow exactly the way that we would like them to, as a parent. And so even though I'm done my parenting stage, I'm really thinking a lot more about that parenting stage and the downloads that I've given my children, because my son is about to become a dad in March. And so it's like, oh, okay, what have I done to like to create some of these things that he's going to have some difficulty with. So being able to have those conversations with him now is something that I get to have, because I am able to do that consciously. Whereas that wasn't a conversation that I would have had with either one of my parents, right?
Yeah. And that's so beautiful that you can have that conversation with your son.
So and it's important, right, for ourselves. And one of the things that you said earlier as well is, we don't get a manual when we become a parent. So when we become a parent and we grow as our children grow, but we also potentially have more than one child,
Yeah.
right? So I had two, and my kids are completely different.
Yeah.
So they are not the same at all, even now. And so that shifts and that changes, and our responses to how we would respond to one child is going to be different to how we were going to respond to another. And one child over the other may get some of the downloads that we got that the other one may not necessarily have received, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And what I would say is, and I'm really aware of not making anyone feel worse about this. Yes, there are going to be generational patterns that are handed down, but when we become more conscious, what we do is we meet ourselves with compassion. So rather than beating ourselves up, oh, I've passed this down to my child, it's like, actually, can I be compassionate with myself, even if I have passed on some of the generational patterns? And is there any repair work I can do, as you so beautifully illustrated there, Rollie, with your own son, that you can have those conversations. So really, it's about using compassion as a tool
Mm-hmm.
for breaking those generational patterns, because they will, excuse me, I've just got a tickle in my throat. Would you mind if I just have a sip of a drink?
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, it's really being compassionate with ourselves, knowing that when we passed on those patterns, we were in an unconscious mode. We did not know what we were doing.
And we don't, right?
We
So
don't.
we
Yeah.
don't know what it is that we're doing when we're using that unconsciousness. And like you said, it's that ebb and flow. So throughout a day you can be very conscious about all the things that you're doing, and then at some point the unconscious kicks in. And then I like the other part of it that you because again, I would have never thought about this one, is the self-conscious parenting, right? So all of those things, because when we go into a play group, for example, we're then worried about like what's everybody else thinking and what is everybody else doing, and oh, they're doing that differently with their child, and oh, my child is behaving this way, so like what's going to happen, and how, and they're judging me on how I'm going to respond in this particular situation. So you've got these three different aspects of how you're going to be in any given circumstance. And I think that that has a huge impact as well on that those feelings of guilt and shame, right?
Yeah,
So
absolutely. Yeah. Shall I talk a little bit more? Shall I talk a little bit about shame now?
absolutely.
Yeah, so that what you've just said leads nicely into shame and guilt. So I'm sure you're aware of Brené Brown's work on shame.
I love Brene Brown.
Yeah. So what I would say with shame, as Brené Brown says, it's quite personal. And when I've worked with parents, I've noticed so much shame in how they parent. And so what I encourage people to do is to, when they're feeling shame, is to locate the feeling of shame in their bodies. And what happens, shame really manages to diminish us. We want to make ourselves smaller. And shame is where we label ourselves. So we'll say, I am a bad parent, or
Yes.
I am a bad person. So it's really kind of really holding that shame within, within our being. So I encourage people to kind of go into themselves and locate where that feeling of shame is. And I appreciate that for some people that might be quite difficult, especially
Yes.
when we're unconscious and we're disconnected. And then what I encourage them to do is imagine that there's a really compassionate, loving observer who witnesses them when they're feeling this shame. And that observer could be a character from a book or a film, or it could be a creature, or it could even be your pet. Anything that works for you, any observer that can be fully loving of you while you're sitting in judgment of yourself. And it's really allowing the unconditional love. So this observer will never think less of you because of
Mm-hmm.
what you've done, because they know that it's just a moment in time. And that observer will never abandon you or reject you. They're just going to be fully present with you, witnessing how you are. And then the idea is that you allow the love, the unconditional love from that observer to flow into the part of you that you've located the feeling of shame. Now, I would say that's one way of reparenting ourselves. And that's the process that we can begin of reparenting ourselves, because imagine if that's what we grew up with, how differently would we show up for ourselves? Because a lot of the unconscious parenting that we've had has led us to feeling guilt, shame, and failure. And that's not to criticize our parents. We've all had these intergenerational downloads that we're passing on. And so if you're in a place now where you can break that download, you're a trailblazer because it's not work that people generally talk about or do.
Hmm.
So that's something that I recommend people do when they're feeling shame.
And I love that that conversation that you had about the intergenerational, because and being able to shift and making changes to those patterns, because one of the things in our culture is that when you heal part of yourself and you heal that inner child, is that you are healing 7 generations back and 7 generations forward. And so I love how you actually talk about that intergenerational, because it's like some people will think, well, it doesn't make any difference, it's not going to make any difference. And from our culture, from the way that we view things, is that it does shift. It shifts the energy from 7 generations back. It heals that inner child. It heals that other, and then we also have the 7 generations forward. So our generations to come will not necessarily get those downloads, because we're shifting those patterns. We're changing the way that we're looking at it, and we're having that opportunity to be able to change the way that we view ourselves. And so
Mm.
I love that. I love how you were able to connect that into that, um, into it, reframe that into that piece of healing.
That's beautiful, Roddy. I really like that. Healing 7 generations back and future generations benefit from that. Yeah, it's beautiful.
So it really
Okay.
does make a difference. So
Yes,
now, what about
absolutely.
guilt? So we talked about
Now,
failure. We talked about shame. Where does guilt
now,
fit in?
guilt is really interesting because I feel that we don't need to eliminate guilt totally. But shame really is about diminishing ourselves and making it very personal. I feel guilt does play a role that can be useful, but it depends on the type of guilt. So when it comes to guilt, it's less personal because it's more about our behavior. So we might label our behavior rather than labeling ourselves. And guilt um, does help us to make amends and to do repair work, which I think is really important.
Hmm.
But where guilt isn't helpful, it's where we, especially with children, where we overcompensate. So, say in the morning something happened and you ended up shouting at your child, and then they come home from school and you're feeling really guilty because you shouted at them in the morning. And what we end up doing is overcompensating for our behavior. So, we might end up giving them their favorite treat or giving them extra time on a computer game. And that creates a difficult dynamic in the relationship because there's no conversation. It's just about trying to almost absolve ourselves of that guilt so we can become guilt free temporarily by overcompensating. And so it bypasses some of the work that we can do. And unfortunately, with that, it becomes a cycle. And I always call it a vicious cycle because we're not breaking it, we're just continuing with it.
Yeah.
That your child does something, then you maybe shout at them or whatever it is that you might do. And then instead of doing any repair work, we go towards overcompensating because, of course, we want children to feel good about themselves again. We don't want our relationship to be affected. We want them to know that we still love them and like them. But what we do is we give them something, or we give them extra time, or whatever it is that we do. And I always think with guilt, and this can be really tricky because it can almost feel like you're punishing yourself, but it's to really just sit with that feeling of guilt. And you can use the same process that I described for shame. But what I also recommend for guilt is to ask some questions. And so it's almost using guilt as a bit of a teacher. So it's asking questions like, what did I need in the moment that I shouted or whatever behavior I did? What was it that
Yeah.
I needed in the moments before? What was it that my child needed? What did they need in the moments before? So when we ask those kinds of questions, rather than the kind of questions we normally ask is, God, today I promised myself that I wouldn't shout at them and I failed again. And then we're feeling guilty. So rather than asking questions like, why do I always do this? Why can't I learn? Why can't I do better? They're all kind of really self-flagellation type of questions. So it's asking questions that could lead to some insight and that could lead to some learning. So
And
asking. Sorry,
yeah,
go
go
on,
ahead.
Rollie.
Sorry. Yeah, there's obviously a delay. I keep getting a unstable internet notification on my internet. So I apologize. So go ahead and finish your thought.
I think I've more or less finished. Yeah. So it's just asking those kind of questions, which means that you're open to learning something about yourself and learning about how to sit with that feeling of guilt rather than just temporarily trying to reduce it, because it will come back again if you don't just dig a little bit deeper and look at maybe why you did something, but not in a punishment way. It's like, what did I need? So
Yes.
identifying your needs in that moment or before that moment.
And because that really does make an impact, that really does make a difference as to how we're going to be able to shift those changes. And like you said, that the guilt is that one of those tricky ones, because it really does impact. Like, we do need to feel wrong about something that we've done wrong. So like if we started yelling, that is not the most appropriate way of being able to respond. So we need to take ownership on that particular thing, but being able to, like you said, going back and having that self observation and having that insight as to, like, why is it that it's happening? Why is it that's going on? So, for example, getting ready for work in the morning. And so you've got yourself getting ready for work in the morning, and you've got your children getting ready for school. And I think this is probably one of the bigger trigger ones for most
Yeah,
families, is that everybody's
absolutely.
trying to get out the door, and there's like so many things going on. And this one hasn't eaten breakfast yet. And then I need this one to get their lunch ready, and all the things. And so then like, now you're running late. Either they've missed the bus or everybody's going to be late for work and school. And like, how is everybody going to get there? And so then that is a trigger, because you have responsibilities. They have responsibilities. There's things that we have to get going that way. So if we actually take a look back at that particular moment of what are some of the things that we can be doing differently so that we can respond differently? What are some of the things that we can teach our children so that they have that response of, like, being able to be rushed in the morning? So so again, I had two different children. One who would actually get up in the morning and be sitting sitting at the door waiting to catch the bus or be driven to school, whatever we were doing that day. And then the other one who was like still sitting in his underwear trying to figure out, like, what am I supposed to do now? Right. So being able to come up with strategies to be able to help everybody in the family so that we can look at it differently. And so for one kid, it was a checklist. Another kid he was fine. So we didn't have to do anything with it. And so, and then that just relieved the stress, where he can actually go off, because I would shoot off saying, "Hey, did you brush your teeth? Did you get dressed? Did you have a shower? Did you?" And then he'd be like, "But I'm already dressed. How come I have to have a shower now?" Because he would be doing this logical thinking. So, like, until we had the conversations, I didn't know that that was one of the things that was, because he would say, "Mom," because we would have family meetings, and he would say, "Mom, I'm so confused. How am I supposed to have a shower after I'm already dressed? Why can't I have a shower before I get dressed?" Like, not that shower was one of those things in the morning, but my things of, like, the things that he needed to be doing. So for me, it was like, "Oh yeah, you need to do this. Oh yeah, you need to do this." And so he just felt like he was flying all over the place. When we set up strategies for him where it was actually helpful, then that alleviated a lot of things. But in the meantime, there was lots of, like, "Oh my God, we're late for school again. Like, oh my God, look at that. Your bus just drove off again. I don't have time to drive you to school. Now I'm going to be late for work," and all those things. Whereas, like, okay, so let's take a look. And these obviously shifted from the time that they were infants and I was getting them ready to go to daycare
Yeah.
versus when they were more independent and getting themselves ready for school. Right. So,
Yeah. And I would say it's like those trigger moments in the morning and maybe bedtime as well, where you've got a bit of a schedule and everybody's got to keep to time, that we can actually come out of consciousness and become more unconscious, because there's an agenda to meet.
mhm.
And oftentimes it's external. And I would say that when we're in the feelings of shame, guilt, and failure, we can't always problem solve. So problem solving can really help when we allow ourselves to sit with those emotions and maybe use some questioning. And the type of questions I always recommend people engage in are questions that are about curiosity. Yeah, so I always say be curious before you come to any conclusions, because it's when we're in curiosity that we're really open to new insights and new learning, rather than when we ask ourselves, why didn't I do this, or why did this happen? It's asking, I wonder what was going on for me. I wonder what was going on for him. I wonder what I needed. Is there a way that I can meet my need? I wonder what he needed. So curiosity before conclusions, I feel, is a really helpful mantra that I use,
I love that.
because,
Curiosity
yeah,
before conclusions. I love that.
yeah,
Because it really does have that impact as to like how can we make things different? How can we make things have a different impact and a different insight
yeah.
on that piece. So I love that. I love that mantra.
Thank you. And I think that's where you can really start problem solving then.
Yes.
Yeah.
Definitely. And that makes a huge difference. So, is there anything else, Tanya, that you wanted to be able to share that we haven't yet covered that you think is really important before we head out?
I would say the most important thing with these kind of big emotions that we have is to offset them through self-compassion. And again, I would say go gently with yourself, because compassion might be something that's not familiar, or doesn't feel like, or we might feel like we don't deserve compassion. And even if you feel that you don't deserve compassion, just sit with that feeling of not deserving, and then become curious. Why would anyone not deserve compassion? And
Mm-hmm.
at what point, from when we were children to when we've become adult, at what point did we stop becoming deserving? Is there a age where we stop becoming deserving?
Yeah.
So it's like, uh, imagine that journey. Why would anyone not deserve compassion? And I would say the first thing is meet yourself with compassion, and then it becomes so much easier to extend it to other people and to children.
And I love that. I love how you're able to piece those things together. So thank you so much for sharing that. So
No.
now, so if somebody was interested in working with you, so what is it that you have that would like? Is there anything that you do specifically that you'd like to share?
Yes, I have a program. It's a one-to-one 4-week parenting program, and it's a mixture of coaching and hypnotherapy. And I find that coaching and hypnotherapy work really well in combination and just make the whole experience more powerful. The coaching is where we'll look at practical solutions, and the hypnotherapy is where we'll deal with some of those more unconscious things that are coming up. So I have that program, and I also work with corporates, because we know that parents are, torn between the two worlds. When they're at work, they feel they're not doing enough. When they're at home, they feel they're not doing enough. And when they're at work, they're thinking about the kids, and when they're with the kids, they think about work. And so always that push pull and feeling torn between the two worlds. And it has an impact, and it takes a toll on parents. So it's how to keep, it's how to kind of meet the needs of parents who are at work as well. So that's my offer for corporates. And I
Yeah.
can share a calendar link for anybody who wants to book in a free 30-minute call with me, where I can share some quick tips, and then they can decide if they want to go on and do a course with me.
Beautiful. So the link that I just finished sharing is www.fullcirclehypnotherapy.co.uk/contact. Is that
So that's my website. So
okay?
that's the contact form on my website. By all means, you can go on my website, and there's a link on there to book a call with me too.
Okay, beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful. So thank you so much, Tanya, for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
And it's beautiful that we've had this opportunity to connect. And thanks again for this incredible conversation, because I know that this is very useful to most parents. I don't know any parents, actually I should say all parents, because I don't know any parents that don't have these challenges.
Thank you so much for having me. And I really enjoyed talking to you, Rollie. It's been amazing. Thank you.
Thanks so much for coming, and we will chat soon. For those of you who are following Chatting with Wisdom, we will be back again next week with another Chatting with Wisdom. Talk to you soon. Bye for now.